the deep background to the War of 1812. Okay, so today I want to talk about how we get to the background of the War of 1812, but in a longer sense, I want to talk about the Panic of 1819. And the Panic of 1819 is a big deal. It's probably the biggest financial panic in the United States in the 1800s. It has a whole bunch of effects over the long term, including the rise of Andrew Jackson. It is discussed very differently in the book than the way I discuss it. So this is 1819. What caused the Panic of 1819 would be a very good question for the next exam, which is the end of March. But I want to talk. So I want to talk a little bit about how we get to the Panic of 1819. To do that, we have to understand the War of 1812 and understand it slightly differently than the way the book understands it. So I don't want to suggest that any of the facts in the book are wrong, but my take on this is a little different from the book. So with that, deep background to the War of 1812 and also an even deeper background to the Panic of 1819. Okay, so let's go back a little bit and discuss Western land settlement, because this is an important for and grain exports, which is a big part of the War of 1812. Okay, so this is the Northwest Territory, and this is territory that is that actually the Confederation Congress. So this is actually before the Constitution. The Confederation Congress decides is going to be split up and created in and create the sort of land system that will become the U.S. land system, or at least the U.S. land system for the northern states. And this is Thomas Jefferson's plan for the expansion of the Northwest. As you can see, Thomas Jefferson had a plan for everything. Almost none of them good, but well, that's not true. Separation of church and state. There are great things about what Jefferson did, but this was his plan for the territories in the West. It was never passed. What's the rationale, I guess, for Jefferson's plan here? What is he on about? What's he doing here in the creation of these territories? Just take a look at these territories and tell me a little bit about what's at stake, just in terms of trade and water and stuff like that. What is his sense? Yeah, okay, control over the Ohio River. So there's nobody gets complete control of the Ohio River. So you get this state of Washington, you get the state of Saratoga, and then the state of Polypotamia, all of which have access to the Ohio River. So there's not one state that has control. What else is going on? Every territory, excellent, Caitlin. Every territory has water access, right? So every territory has access either to the Mississippi River or to the Ohio River or to the Great Lakes, which will ultimately get you over the longer term will get you to the East Coast. Right. And claiming the conquering of other people's lands by using actually the names of the people who've been displaced. Okay. So the Saratoga, the Illinois, the Michigan Indians, and then we'll throw in a couple of ancient Greek colonies as well. But right, this is territory that's taken from in part by conquest, in part by purchase from Native Americans. As Joseph Brand and others moved to Canada, some of this land is taken. So this is his proposal. It doesn't obviously succeed. Illinois, right? I just imagine signing having your address in Palopotamia or Asanapia. I mean, I don't know. We've normalized Mississippi and the other names which are not which are native names We've turned them into our own. Okay, so his point is access to water. And the access to the water, the significance of that, right, Pelosophia, and of course we're going to pronounce it the way that we want, rather than the way that Native people would have pronounced some of these names. So I was on the History Channel a while ago, and I said Nevada. Nevada instead of Nevada. And I got all these irate letters from people sent to me saying the word is Nevada, not Nevada. But of course, the word is Sierra Nevada. It's a Spanish word. Anyways, be that as it may. We have this basically a plan for Western settlement that's very important to Jefferson, because remember, Jefferson is from Virginia, and Virginia had that crazy system of head rights, right? Where land was all over the place, and people's borders were constantly being contested by other people. And so Jefferson wants, above all, an orderly system. And the other folks in Northwest Ordinance who passed the Northwest Ordinance do. And so what we get in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 are a few things that are going to be important, very important for understanding how the Civil War, how and why the Civil War takes place later. So, but above all, I guess my take, and this is back to who is that? I can't see my screen. Caitlin Davis's point about water access is that a lot of this land is really premised. The hope is that this land is going to produce crops, cash crops, that are going to be sold on the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, or on the Great Lakes, ultimately to the Caribbean. That's primarily what people are interested in settling in these lands. Is they want access to water, access to roads, being able to sell these goods. Okay, so the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 does some interesting things. It first of all makes this square, right? And so a section of land is 640 acres, which is a vast portion of land. And there are half acres and half quarters. And so 640 acres is a section. A half section is 320 acres. A quarter section is 160 acres. And one of the things you'll notice here is that income from Section 16 here in every territory is reserved for the support of public schools. And this is really important to the people in the Constitutional Convention, what is it called? That's before the Congress, before the Continental Congress. No, it is the Continental Congress. They want school support. They want public schools. And so a portion of all the land is going to be reserved for public schools, and a portion of all the revenue is going to be reserved for public schools to ensure that there are public schools in these places. Everybody who moves into this territory gets trial by jury, freedom of worship, and no slavery. Right? So as the states themselves are abolishing slavery, as Connecticut and Rhode Island and in 1787 are, after the war, some of them have already abolished it. Some of them are in the process of abolishing it, like New York and others. Those are northern states. We see established in the Northwest Ordinance a policy that there's going to be no slavery. Okay, and then a model here for expansion. Less than 5,000 citizens. There is a congressionally appointed governor, his secretary, and 3 judges. And then once the territory gets to 5,000 citizens, they can elect a legislature. The governor is still appointed by the Congress. And then once they get to 60,000, they can write a state constitution to be approved by Congress. And crucially, in this formation, and this is very different from the way in which other states expand in Europe and elsewhere, is those states then become equal to the other states in the Union. And so this is a model for expansion and kind of grabbing of other people's land that simultaneously gives the periphery, those places on the edge, the same status as Massachusetts and Connecticut and things like that. And so, whether we can talk about the pluses and minuses of this system. And there are certainly lots of minuses about the removal of people from this land, of claiming land that's actually claimed by other native peoples. But this process is, in comparison to the way in which Russia expands, or the way in which France expands, what we see are the sort of process of expansion in which each of the states is equal. Okay. Now, the Southwest Ordinance has a somewhat similar pattern, a somewhat similar grid, but there are a few things that don't work. One of them is that, as you see, the enslavers in the South alter the Southwest Ordinance. They take the Northwest Ordinance and they say, oh yeah, trial by jury, definitely. Freedom of religion, absolutely. But provided always that no regulations made or to be made by Congress shall tend to emancipate slaves. So the claim for these regions is that there will be slavery, or at least slavery can't be removed by Congress. Is that clear? So what we get in the early colonies is, which become states, is a variety of means of dealing with enslavement. Georgia initially, in 1788, has no slavery, and then it does by 1788. No. In the 1690s, early settlement of Georgia has no slavery. Eventually, it does have slavery. New York has slavery. It ends around 1812 or 1813. Pennsylvania has slavery. But then New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island have no slavery at all. And so we see a variety of different approaches to slavery in these regions. But in the Northwest and the Southwest, we see a pretty distinctive line between places in which slavery is not permitted and places in which slavery is not prohibited. Okay? The other thing that's, exactly when, I'm not sure. People brought enslaved people in Georgia going back quite a ways, but boy, that's like 5 chapters ago, so I've already forgotten. I should know, I get it, but I don't, so I'll look it up. Okay, so much of the territory south of the Ohio River was also owned by what Americans then called the 5 civilized tribes. So this would be Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and Tennessee are the states that are included. Yes. Basically, Oglethorpe, when he establishes the colony of Georgia, wants there to be no slavery in Georgia. That lasts for about 10 years, and then slavery is baked into Georgia's constitution, or Georgia's colony after that. It's basically established that there will be slavery in Georgia. Okay, but that's about 100 years before the period that we're talking about. Now, much of the territory south of the Ohio River was owned by what Americans then called the 5 civilized tribes. Yeah, it's saying if the Congress wants to emancipate slaves, we're just going to ignore them. Not only that, but they're not allowed by the ordinance to do anything. And anything they do, that it's basically it's an attempt to sort of force Congress not to make any legislation on slavery or the end of slavery. Is that clear? Okay. But basically, yeah, if it says Congress says to emancipate slaves, we're going to ignore them. Okay. So I've talked about access to water. I've talked about this sort of attempt to make an organized settlement. I've talked about a separation between the Northwest and Southwest ordinances. Now I want to talk a little bit about land prices, because this is really important for understanding the future financial problems. Okay, so land prices drop over time. Jefferson cuts the price of land in half. It was $2 an acre minimum under Adams. After 1800, it's $1 an acre. Oh, sorry, I don't have that. The price goes down. And the other thing that Jefferson does, right, is split the territories in half. So previously you have to, under Adams, a section was all you could buy. And that meant only very, very large landowners, people with a lot of wealth could buy land. Jefferson splits that in half and then a half again. And so it's possible to get 160 acres. And the other thing that Jefferson does is allow you to pay on it installments, basically over 4 years. And potentially 5 and potentially 6. There are, if you can't pay for a year, as long as you pay a little bit, you can continue to make the claim, and then a year later can make your payment. So here's the right? The is that basically the land office is becoming a bank, right? The land office is not selling land. It's basically allowing you to pay something for land and then pay it off in installments. Does that make sense? What's the problem with this system? Where are the potential dangers here? Why do I say for a 4-year mortgage? Okay, potentially corruption. And there was considerable corruption in the land office. But what else is dangerous about a land office that offers land in installments in this way? Maybe too short a time span, potentially financial crisis. The possibility that people won't pay it, right? And that the debts will be higher until payments, and then potentially credit until the next payment, right? So there's what this institution is doing is basically creating a credit system. In a certain sense, this land office is like a bank that's offering land on credit with a discount for cash, but selling a lot of land basically on credit. And if those people can't pay off, what happens? There is a fairly organized system for this. You get a land warrant. Bear with me here for a second. You get a warrant for land when you then pay it off over 4 years. Yeah, you might have the possibility that the government has to pay the debts. In fact, what's going to happen is that you're never going to get a deed to the property. You'll get a warrant. You'll settle on the property, and then the bank, the U.S., might have to foreclose on you if you don't make the payments in 4 years or 5 years or 6 years. In fact, that's what's going to happen in the Panic of 1819. Is that a whole lot of this land that is sold on credit is not going to be paid off. And effectively, the federal government is going to get it back and then have to resell it. Does that make sense? So basically, the land office is entering into the banking business by Jefferson's credit scheme. Why would Jefferson want to create a credit scheme? Why would Jefferson, whose party is organized with James Madison and Chancellor Livingston in New York, why would Jefferson be keen on this? Okay, that's one thing is he wants to make sure that non-slave holders or maybe people who don't have a whole lot of money are going to be able to have this land. And so there's a democratic part to this, certainly. Agricultural development, okay. More votes. There is definitely that, right? You're going to absolutely have a chance for re-election if everybody that you get land and you get land, like Oprah, you get land and you get land and you get land. So the possibility there. Okay, right. And so it's also possible for people to get more land. The other thing is having the land office as a bank makes it something that's different from the Bank of the United States, right? So credit previously in the Bank of the United States goes to merchants and to the United States, but it's particularly rich merchants. Jefferson's plan is a sort of shadow Bank of the United States. The land office becomes a creditor rather than the Bank of the United States, a lender rather than the Bank of the United States. Does that make sense? So the Bank of the United States was lending to merchants when it started in 1791 and is going to continue to. Yeah, exactly. So he did not like Hamilton's bank. He wanted to create his own bank, but not call it a bank. A bank that favors landowners, right? A bank that favors farmers rather than a bank that favors merchants. Does that make sense? Okay. So the land office is the biggest bank in the world when it's established effectively, offering millions of dollars of credit over the long term. This whole system is a kind of invention of his. Right? It's definitely agricultural elitism on his part, right? Because he believes that expansion through space is more important than expansion through time. He believes that agriculture, that the U.S. should become an agricultural nation and not a nation of satanic mills and large urbanization. But there's also a more practical sense in that, as Melissa said, there's a chance for re-election. Yeah, in terms of the actual assets that are available on credit, there's more. It's larger than the Bank of the United States. Yeah, it is true. In fact, that's why we have spring break. That's why there's uh, we do this in the fall and then in the spring. People go back not because of Christmas, but because for the harvest. So yeah, the university system, our schedule is based on harvesting, making sure that lots of people. Right, we don't have spring break. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's just. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to touch a nerve there. Okay. So the federal land office is incredibly popular. When the land is issued, people it's offered as for bid, and thousands of people show up. Tens of thousands of people show up to the land office on the day that auctioning this property takes place. People will show up. They'll make their bids, and then they'll engage in this installment plan where they'll pay it off in chunks. Sorry, yeah. So this picture is actually from an 1890 land office auction, but so we don't obviously have photographs from the 18 teens and the 1820s because there weren't photographs then. But this is what a land office looked like with thousands of people all lined up to buy land. This was actually one of the first land offices in Ohio. This picture here at the top, which was discovered inside another building. And it was a kind of massive interest. Lots and lots and lots of people, regular people, wanted access to this land. Okay, so the land office is popular, but it's a credit system that is potentially going to lead to a land bubble or a price bubble. And I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. All of this is premised, particularly in the Northwest, on being able to produce wheat and then sell it, have it go down the Ohio River, have it go down the Mississippi River, and go to the Caribbean colonies, or across the Atlantic to Spain and Italy and Great Britain. Okay, so much of this area, the expectation is it's going to grow grain, which is going to be turned into wheat, which is going to be turned into flour, and that flour is going to be shipped around the world. That's the hope, anyways, for many of these farmers. Okay, and as we saw in the last lecture, the opening of the Mississippi River, the Louisiana Purchase, makes possible even more westward expansion and makes it possible to actually sell grain and things like that through New Orleans without having to pay a tariff. Okay, so Louisiana Territory, though, had already been settled by France, and it has very different laws than the English legal, the sort of American system. And I just want to mention this because it's interesting and significant. Is this old? Oh, because those colonies cannot feed themselves. They're producing coffee, sugar, and other goods. They could potentially feed themselves, but most of the acreage is devoted to producing coffee, sugar, and cotton, long staple cotton, and what was the other one? Cocoa. All of these other sort of staple goods in a system of slavery. Food is going to be coming from, particularly flour, is going to be coming from the United States. And in fact, that's what the United States supplies to the Caribbean in this period, is flour. It's one of the biggest exports. Okay, so the Old Southwest Territory, what's going to be called the state of Louisiana, has very different laws. Okay, first of all, it's French law initially, and when it's brought in and incorporated into the United States, it has a different legal system, and that's still true today. That the Louisiana legal system is very different from the legal system of other parts of the United States. So the Code Napoleon, the sort of French legal code, emphasizes a family interest, and so men are not the primary interest. It's primarily families. So that means that ownership of land and things like that is associated with both men and women. Wives are viewed as partners. Wives cannot be disowned by their husbands. So if a husband, for example, takes another wife and disowns that wife and gives her nothing upon his death, that's perfectly acceptable in Alabama or South Carolina. Women have no legal status even to challenge that. In Louisiana, that's not the case. In Louisiana, wives are considered partners, and they cannot be in the case where a husband dies, they can't be denied in a will access to that land. Yeah, it's so in a so divorce would have been something that would have happened in the church or not, but the point is that men could not make decisions without their wives being in some sense involved in the process, and they legally could not be eliminated from having access to land that their husbands have access to in this system. Bastards are also legitimized. Bastards are people who are born out of wedlock when a husband and wife when a man and a woman are not married. If an enslaver has basically rapes a slave, and the child that's produced is his child, then that child is now a descendant and is entitled to a part of the inheritance. Right. Game of Thrones. Okay. The other thing that's interesting is that free persons of color have rights of citizens. So free persons of color are allowed to vote in Louisiana. And so it's a very different system. But that said, all right, so it's in terms of the relationship between men and women, it's there's very much a kind of emphasis on protecting a family so that no children are left without support in the case a husband dies, for example. And so in property context, it's defending women and men together. Men have more priority and more authority, but women cannot be disowned. Women cannot be deprived of the land that they are in part living on. But on the other hand, this also helps entrench the power of the largest landowners because the land was broken up in a way that was preferential or supported very, very large land holdings. This is what land holdings looked like in Louisiana. Okay, and this is a very different system, right? These are plots that are all have a position on the river. And by and large, these are large plantations. It does look like a board game, right? And they actually, this map it's an interesting map. It's actually got the names of the people that own this land. And this is primarily slave owners that own this land. Okay, there are a few freeholders, but by and large, these plots, even the ones that look pretty skinny from our perspective, are actually hundreds of acres and are basically for the export of cotton primarily. Okay, so the position, the legal position, the kind of status position of biracial people is different in Louisiana than it is under the rest of sort of English law. And so what we see is an emergence of a kind of free people of color in New Orleans who have rights as citizens. Eventually, that citizenship is going to go away by the 1820s and 1830s. But in the early period, people who are biracial, who are descended from planters and things like that, have certain rights and authority. Yeah, I want to say that this is probably again a British. Whoops. British artist, so nothing is going to work to scale. Maybe they're puppies. Yeah. They look like maybe Chihuahua. Yeah, they're actually impossibly small, right? That's like smaller than a foot, that dog there at the bottom. I hadn't thought about that. Um, that's a good question. And I'm not sure. I think so. When the citizenship is taken away, in the 1820s, and it's going to be associated with Andrew Jackson. When Andrew Jackson emerges, we're going to see democratization of southern states, broadening the citizenship, but it's also going to be based on white citizenship. So in the early periods, there's a group of black men, for example, who write to Andrew Jackson and say, "We voted for you, and you're pushing for this free white citizenship that's basically denying us the right to vote." Yeah, it wasn't basically interracial relationships happened whether they were legal or not. In fact, they were considered illegal in France, but in this French colony of Louisiana, but there was in a it was still the expectation was that the children of that relationship would be protected in part if one could determine for sure who the father was. Yeah, so New Orleans regressed backwards. It went from free people of color having citizenship to some denial of that citizenship later. Louisianians, biracial Louisianians could vote in the state elections, but not in federal elections after the 1820s. All right, this is a little bit more complicated, but I want to give us a sense of what's going on at the international level. Okay, so from 1800 to 1811, the U.S. is smuggling goods between France and French ports, and this is funded by the Bank of the United States. Okay, so the way it worked, bear with me here for a second. Get a map. All right, and this is a map for the War of 1812, but to give you a sense. So an American ship would leave a port in, say, Rhode Island. It would go to it would say that it was going to go to a British port or a Spanish port, but it would actually end up at a French port. It would pick up sugar and coffee and possibly cotton on its ship. And then it would go across the Atlantic Ocean, stop at the Isle of Man or some other island, take their bill of lading and the bills of lading and all the official documents, destroy them, reconstitute the ship as a French ship, and then fly and then go into a French port and claim or fly an American flag and claim that they were sort of off course, avoid a British blockade, and then land in France. So what American merchants are doing is basically selling French Caribbean goods to France and then selling French goods back to the French Caribbean. So it's engaged in what's called a transit trade, where it's basically bypassing the blockade, the British blockade. So the British are blockading France, preventing France from trading with its colonies. American ships, flying in most cases American flags, are acting as a neutral party and engaging in this trade themselves. Okay, this is illegal according to Britain, but the U.S. does it anyways. The other thing that the U.S. does is trade with all these Caribbean colonies that are now the Dutch colonies, Danish colonies, Swedish colonies, French colonies, Spanish colonies, all these other Caribbean colonies that are not British colonies are now fair game for the United States because it's a neutral party. So by 1800, there are actually more American merchant ships at sea than there are British merchant ships at sea. Exactly. It's not illegal if you don't get caught. And even insurers for these folks. Oh, so the reason that Britain wants to block France is because Britain is engaged in a war with France over the period of, say, 1800, almost the entire period from 1793 to 1815. Britain and France are engaged in war. Napoleonic Wars, right? They're initially the wars of the French Revolution, and then when Napoleon comes to power, they're the Napoleonic Wars. But those wars are vital. Okay, so let's take a look at this. This is why Europe needs American grain. So the Caribbean colonies need grain, and they always have. But Europe also needs grain because lots and lots of young men are fighting in this war in which France is basically rapidly expanding all across, under Napoleon, is rapidly expanding all across Europe. All right, and so it takes Spain, it marches through Spain, and then turns Spain into a dependent state. It marches across what's effectively Germany, and separates it from the German principalities, calls it a Confederation of the Rhine. It is engaged in battle with the Austrian Empire, and then the Austrian Empire ultimately becomes an ally of Napoleon. It marches through Naples and Italy and annexes some of those. No, it doesn't annex them. It creates dependent states of them in places like Naples. It takes over Rome, it takes over Genoa, and then it creates a dependent state in the southern part of Italy. It finally, by 1812, marches on Russia. Okay, so this chaos from all of this fighting means that Spain and France and Great Britain, which are engaged in battles with one another, much of the soldiers are at war. Wheat fields are burning throughout Europe, and as a result, wheat prices increase rapidly to 5 times their price. The ships that are French and British ships are provisioned in American ports because they're neutral ports. Okay? So this means that wheat prices are going to skyrocket, right? And that was the image we saw last class. The wheat prices skyrocket from, say, 1790 to 1815. And so that's in part why people want to settle in this land and grow wheat. This is why all of these people are rushing to the land office to get their 160 acres, to grow some food and have it shipped to New Orleans and out to other places, because wheat prices go up very, very high. Okay. The merchants who are engaged in this trade are basically smuggling in many cases. In 1807, Britain issues orders in council that restrict the carrying trade. And this is James Stephen, who's a Tory, is the person who's behind this. He says the U.S. is engaged in a war in disguise by flying neutral flags and basically trading with the enemy. It's supposed to be just trading between the U.S. and France. Instead, it's bringing gunpowder to and other goods that are supposed to be not provided to France to France. It's bringing and it's engaged in trade between France and the French colonies. It's doing all sorts of trade that it's not supposed to be doing. The British orders in council restrict the carrying trade, and the U.S. merchants basically ignore it. In 1807 to 1808, which we saw in this chapter, Jefferson imposes an embargo. Merchants ignore it. All of this trade, or almost all of this trade, is being funded by the Bank of the United States, which is providing credit to merchants to engage in this trade. Now, there's one reason why British merchants are willing to accept this, and that's a very cynical reason, which is that lots of British merchants have been paid for American goods with stock in the Bank of the United States, or bonds from the Bank of the United States. If they hold stock in the Bank of the United States, the Bank of the United States does extremely well between 1791 and 1811 in effectively funding this trade. But, as you remember, the Democratic Republicans hate the Bank of the United States, even after Hamilton dies in 1804 in his at Weehawken in the battle that, well, it's not a battle, it's a, why is my brain not working today? I need spring break too. It's, sorry. The duel that he has that kills him, even after Hamilton is dead. Jefferson and Madison believe that the Bank of the United States is, Satan's spawn, and they try to stop it. In 1811, the Democratic Republicans ensure that the Bank of the United States is not rechartered. The Bank of the United States in 1811 pays off all of its stockholders, and suddenly British merchants have no interest in U.S. smuggling. Suddenly, British merchants are not directly benefiting from U.S. smuggling. And these Anglo-British tensions will lead to the War of 1812. Okay. Now, the War of 1812 is declared by the United States against Great Britain. No, there weren't really that many shares in the Bank of the United States, so it was mostly British merchants that held them. But I don't think... I would have to look, but I don't think that there weren't that many publicly traded shares in the Bank of the United States. But it's possible. I know that the second Bank of the United States, those shares were traded, but I'm not sure. They would have been bought and sold in London by stockbrokers, but I'm not sure. There wasn't exactly a London stock exchange. I guess that's the thing, is there isn't a stock exchange that determines what's effectively legit and not legit stock like we have now. And so stockbrokers would sell stock in the Bank of the United States. You could buy it, but there wasn't any kind of legitimate framing around it like the London Stock Exchange. So you went to a stockbroker and you could buy this stock, and it would be occasionally listed in the London Times what the price of that stock was. Does that make sense? So it's not really on the London Stock Exchange, but you could buy it in London from a stockbroker or sell it in London. Okay. Yep. So the Warhawks, yes. Right. Exactly. The Treaty of Ghent doesn't mention the original reasons for war, because the original reasons for war on the part of the British are all of this smuggling that's happening that is basically preventing their blockade of France. The Warhawks are a group of people, mostly that are almost entirely Democratic Republicans, who criticize the merchants for trading with France, and they criticize the British for keeping forts in Florida and Illinois. Okay? So this is the Warhawks, and two of the famous Warhawks are Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. The person who comes up with the term is John Randolph. John Randolph says, you people are picking a fight with Great Britain. And he calls them the Warhawks. He says that you are basically spoiling for a fight with Great Britain. You're going to lead us into war with Great Britain. And the people who are irritating them are these merchants who are trading with France. But your constant attacks on British forts in Florida and Illinois are going to lead us into war. Okay. So we have the Napoleonic conflict, which is also providing a market for American grain. The U.S. is selling that grain across the Atlantic Ocean, in particular to Spain and also Italy. And its biggest market is in Great Britain. Napoleon is trying to block off every port that he can by declaring these independent republics here in green, which are major grain ports, basically to prevent Britain from having grain. The lack of grain in Britain is another reason why Americans are able to sell grain at relatively high prices. Napoleon's attack on France, Napoleon's attack on Russia is a failed campaign that's going to destroy Napoleon ultimately. And this is a map of the losses of the French campaign. France starts with almost 500,000 soldiers in this conflict, and the image here shows you what happens to the French army as it's marching across Europe. Right? And this is actually moving over time. We see this is basically the French army that's basically dying or disappearing or basically leaving the French army, deserting the French army. But there's and also dying in these long drawn out battles. And so what we see here is an army of 500,000, almost 500,000, that becomes 100,000 by the time it gets to Moscow. Right, unless you're the Mongols. And then, you can eat breakfast in St. Petersburg and have lunch in, lunch in Odessa or something like that. The ability of the Mongols to move around in what Russia thinks of as its territory was tremendous. Okay, so this then leads us to the War of 1812. Basically, according to Britain, the U.S. is engaged in a war in disguise. The Warhawks are keen for a conflict with Great Britain. And and they declare war against Great Britain. Great Britain is actually prepared for this. The Navy is prepared for a conflict with the United States, and it blockades all of the major American ports. I'm not going to go through the individual battles because they're chaotic. They're battles in which most cases the United States loses, just as in the American Revolution. but there are a couple of successful campaigns. One of them is the burning of York, which we now call Toronto. But by and large, basically Britain and its allies sort of kicked America's butt for a couple of years in this conflict. Washington, D.C. is burned on August 24th of 1814, repainting the outside of the president's mansion is why it's called the White House. And this is this conflict. So if you think about the Federalist Party now, the Warhawks are the ones who want war. I'm sorry, yeah. The Warhawks are the ones who want war, and John Randolph of Roanoke is one of the few people that criticizes them for leading us into war. But no, the Warhawks want war with Great Britain. They criticize the merchants for causing the war, or causing the British to be angry, but they're spoiling for a conflict with Great Britain. Okay, so the Warhawks say that it's not our fault; it's the fault of these merchants. But if Britain wants a war, we're happy to give them one. Does that make sense? All right, and so this is the burning of Washington on August 24th of 1814. Baltimore, other major ports are attacked by the British. And this is a sort of, as you can see, a kind of triumphal vision of the British invasion of Washington, the destruction of the buildings. But as Napoleon is defeated by 1815, after the Treaty of Ghent, when Great Britain is again at peace with the United States, Great Britain signs a peace treaty, but there are lots of people in Great Britain that are still angry about the U.S. having engaged in illicit trade with France throughout this conflict. In 1815 and 1816 and 1817, the British enact a series of laws that are called the Corn Laws. And yes, the Federalist Party dies. If you imagine imagine sort of siding with the British, because the Federalists tended to side with the British. That party, the party that sides, once the city is burned, right? Once Washington is burned, once the British engage in all of this conflict, any party that supports Britain is going to be dead in the water. And that's effectively what happens. Federalists no longer call themselves Federalists. Some of those people remain in power, but they call themselves Democratic Republicans once the war is over. The Federalist Party is basically gone by 1815. There was no one that will call himself a Federalist after the burning of Washington. The people who had been in the Federalist Party who are not voted out of office, and a bunch of them are voted out of office in 1815 and 1816, are basically just going to call themselves Democratic Republicans. And so that's when we get what's called the era of good feelings. The era of good feelings starts in 1815 because there's only one party. By 1815, there's only one party, and that's the Democratic Republicans. There is no person who is willing to call himself a Federalist and run for office. Right? Yeah. I mean, this is people have brought this up, but a direct attack on Washington does, as you can imagine, lead to effectively the collapse of the party. A very similar thing happens to the Northern Democratic Party during the Civil War, the American Civil War. Is the Northern Democratic Party, people in the party call themselves constitutional unionists and call themselves other things. Okay. So, yeah, so the Federalists die out because the Federalists support the British. The Democratic Republicans had always tended to support France. And the Federalists die out because once the British attack Washington, D.C., oh, yeah, after Pearl Harbor, the German American Bund, the people who support Germans after Pearl Harbor are just kind of gone as a political institution. Okay, so what Britain passes then in 15, 16, and 17 is a series of acts called the Corn Laws. I'll just and remember that the British refer to wheat as corn, right? And so the Corn Laws are a bunch of barriers that are imposed on wheat prices. And basically a tax, a very, very high tax imposed on any grain that comes into Great Britain. Partly this is to block American grain. Partly it's also to block Russian grain because a lot of Russian grain starts to come out of this region once the war happens. If you look at where southern Russia is here, it's totally separated from all of this conflict that's going on. And so southern Russia is producing, from Odessa, is producing all this grain which is being sold in Italy and Spain and elsewhere. So Great Britain passes the Corn Laws in 1816, 17, 15, 16, and 17, which block all grain coming into Great Britain. It also blocks grain coming into the British Caribbean. When Napoleon is defeated in 1815, Britain has control of most of the Caribbean colonies, right? Martinique, Guadeloupe, a lot of previously French colonies are briefly in the hands of Britain. Cuba is in the hands of Spain, but a lot more of the Caribbean colonies are in the hands of Britain, and Britain has basically blocked, by 1818, all of the grain coming from the United States. It imposes tariffs on it. It creates two free ports. One in Toronto, one in Halifax. Basically, in Canada, which are supposed to be, and these free ports, those ports can sell to the Caribbean with no charge. But American ports, a seller of grain who's coming from Philadelphia, or who's coming from Boston, or who's coming from Baltimore, who comes into a British Caribbean port with grain is going to be charged a surcharge or a tax of close to 25%. This tax is basically going to destroy all of the grain trading that the United States is doing. The grain trade that had previously supported the Caribbean and also supported Europe goes away. Wheat prices drop 65% in the United States at the end of 1818. And that is the background for the Panic of 1819. If we want to talk about the Panic of 1819, a big part of it has to do with the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the establishment of the Corn Laws. The extension of the Corn Laws in 1817 to include the British colonies ensures that no one in the U.S. is going to be in a position to provision Great Britain. Oh, bear with me here for a second. I forgot. St. John is the other Caribbean colony. So Halifax, Nova Scotia, and St. John in New Brunswick. Those are the two. Yep. Okay. So, let me go do the Corn Laws again. So the Corn Laws are basically Britain's attempt to block American corn, that is wheat, from Britain and then by 1818 to block American wheat coming into the Caribbean colonies. Now, when creating Halifax and St. John as free ports means that it's still possible for Americans to take grain from Baltimore, send it all the way up here to Halifax or St. John, sell it there at no tariff, and then a British ship can take it from Halifax or St. John to the Caribbean. So it's still possible to get that American grain, but only in British ships. Okay? And so this, on top of the, so it is possible to sell it without a tax in Halifax or St. John, but only British ships coming from Halifax or St. John are allowed to sell in the Caribbean. What this does is effectively impose a distance tariff. So it makes it more expensive for those goods to go, and they only go in British boats to the British Caribbean. The price, as a result of grain, drops considerably. Grain is produced a little bit in this area up here and around Toronto, but it had always, by and large, been importing grain. It had been importing a lot of grain across the Great Lakes. So these ports are basically dead in the water by 1818. American land prices, American grain prices drop 65% in 1819. American land prices drop as well. And so this is the number of acres that are sold in the United States up to 1818, right? And you see that peak there and then the sudden drop off in land sales. That's because no one has money to buy land. And all the people that have bought land on credit in, say, 1816 or 1815 are now in a position not to be able to pay that loan back. Okay? So tens of millions of acres, not tens of millions, no, hundreds of thousands of acres are returned to the United States over the period from 1818 to 1825. And that's the Panic of 1819, is grain prices have dropped precipitously because of a trade war between the United States and Great Britain. The corn laws that are blocking American grain from going to the Caribbean, blocking American grain from going to Great Britain itself. That downturn is going to be the deep background for the Panic of 1819. Okay, yeah. So from 1817 to 1819, land sales shoot up to 1818. And then in 1818, when Great Britain's blockade corn laws extend to the Caribbean, the British Caribbean, at that point, wheat prices drop precipitously by about 60%, 65%. And when that happens, people can't sell the wheat that's necessary to support their purchases of land, right? So they have to surrender that land. A lot of that land goes back to the United States. And that's the panic in 1819. Okay, are there questions? So all of these issues that I've been talking about, yeah, all these issues I've been talking about are discussed in the book, but they're just not told in a way that makes, or most of them are discussed in the book, but they're not told. Okay, so basically the corn laws are British tariffs on grain going into Great Britain. Okay, so when Britain passes the corn laws, it says any grain that's a tariff on that the British impose, that says any grain that comes into Britain, if it's not British grain, if it's not from Britain or its colonies, then there will be a surcharge of 15 or 20 shillings per barrel of grain, so a tax basically on grain. And the tax is so high that there's almost no grain that comes to Britain, except from its colonies. And there aren't a whole lot of British colonies at this point that produce that much grain. So as a result, the Corn Laws block American grain. No, people didn't starve. Yeah, I mean, it's an Anglo-Saxon word, corn. It refers to the little bud of the thing that you eat, and so it was arguably Americans' fault for referring to maize as corn, because that was in the 1700s, in the 1600s rather, early 1700s, the thing that most people ate was corn. And so we called it corn. But yeah, wheat was called corn in Great Britain, and Americans, for whatever reason, took corn and started calling maize corn, and that's confused everybody. Now Great Britain has finally given up and refers to it as refers to it using the American terms. So the Corn Laws were tariffs on wheat coming into Britain. And in 1818, those tariffs are extended to the Caribbean so that wheat can't come into the British Caribbean without paying a high tax. The only way that the wheat can come without a tax coming into the Caribbean is if it first touches a port in Newfoundland or Canada, and that's going to greatly increase the price of it. Maybe. I think the simplest explanation is that all of this cheap grain that was coming in was awesome for Great Britain when Great Britain is at war. But people who own large amounts of land, like Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, right, are not happy when wheat prices get cheap. And when cheap wheat is coming in from Russia and cheap wheat is coming in from the United States, it's an issue of self-preservation for them. They want wheat prices to go back up, and they do. They go back up considerably once the Corn Laws are passed. Yeah, it is spiteful. But it's also, if you think about how Britain operates, you've got a landed gentry. These families that have tremendously large holdings, and they have workers, tenants on the land that's producing grain for them. They don't actually grow grain. It's other people that grow grain for them. But they don't want grain prices to go so low, and as a result, they'll impose taxes on it to defend it. And so the Corn Laws are passed in 15 through 17 as a way of bumping up prices so that people who have large estates can continue to live the way that they had lived before the wars. Other questions? Oh, they still ate bread, still ate grain, but it was British grain. Right? If you think about Britain is a very agricultural place, right? Lots and lots of areas in the north and the west of Britain are growing wheat in this period. And so wheat is there. People are getting the wheat. It's just expensive. It got more expensive when the Corn Laws are passed. And a high price for food is something that people who have farms like. Right? Other questions? Okay. So to recap, the deep background to the War of 1812. Yeah. My take is that the War of my take about the Panic of 1819 is the 1819 panic has a lot to do with a land bubble as prices as land values go up, when wheat is very expensive, wheat prices are very high in the United States. Wheat prices are very high in the United States because of what's effectively a world war in Europe that includes the Caribbean. that involves merchants who are taking that grain and selling it to the Caribbean and to Spain and to Italy, bypassing the British blockade. Once the war is over and the US goes and Europe goes back to normal, Great Britain imposes corn laws to block American grain from coming to Britain and extends those corn laws in 1818 to include the Caribbean. American wheat prices, as a result, drop precipitously, and that's the Panic of 1819. We're going to talk more about the Panic of 1819. We're going to talk about the banks and things like that before, but I wanted to give you a sense of this. So there's an asset bubble for me, the Panic of 1819 is an asset bubble in grain brought about by an extended war in Europe. Other questions? People know what an asset bubble means? What that means? It's when prices go up for something. Okay, so an asset bubble is when prices go up for some reason. A bunch of people make a lot of decisions about those prices by buying a lot of land, say, on credit. And then when the price goes down, they're stuck because they've accrued all this debt that they cannot pay off. And so that leads to bankruptcy. And bankruptcy leads to bank failure. So there was an asset bubble in land, which was based on wheat. When the wheat can no longer be exported, the wheat prices drop, the land prices drop, and people are stuck. In around 1999 and 2000, there was an asset bubble in tech stocks, including pets.com and things like that, where people are buying and buying and buying those stocks, but their ultimate value was actually much less than this. And once people start to discover this, the stock prices are dumped, and we get the dot-com crash. In 2008, the same thing was true in American mortgages, when people thought that land prices for houses were going to go up and up and up, and people bought more and more of them on credit. And when the housing prices dropped considerably in 2008, a lot of people who had mortgages were stuck. Like Beanie Babies. Same thing. Price goes up, a bunch of people buy them, and then make all these decisions based on that thing going up and up and up and up, and then suddenly it stops going up. The reason that wheat prices go up and up and up is 20 years of war. Once that war is over, and once Britain decides that it's going to block grain first to Britain and then to its colonies, means that those prices are going to go back down again.